Welcome to the Massachusetts Attorney General's webinar on labor trafficking, specifically designed to raise awareness among the Commonwealth's municipal officials about recognizing the signs of this crime and how to handle suspicious activity. This webinar is a joint effort between the Attorney General's Fair Labor Division and Human Trafficking Division. In the fall of 2017, our two divisions started a working group in a collaborative effort to locate and prosecute crimes of forced services. While our office has a well-established track record of successful prosecutions of sex trafficking, labor trafficking cases have been more difficult to identify. And one of the factors that makes it so difficult for these cases to surface is a lack of awareness among law enforcement and members of the public that these crimes are actually occurring in the United States and even in our state. Here at the Attorney General's office, we are working to step up our efforts to bring victims out of the shadows and perpetrators to justice. On behalf of Attorney General Maura Healey, thank you for taking the time to view this material. We intend that this partnership with each of you will not end at the conclusion of the webinar, but serve as a mutual resource for you and us as your Attorney General's office. Today we will cover the following topics: the scope of the issue and challenges with regard to labor trafficking. We'll go over our Result app, which is a labor trafficking app specifically for Massachusetts, indicators of labor trafficking, the law in Massachusetts, dealing with victims, and available remedies. To give you an idea of the scope of trafficking, you will see here on this slide statistics from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. The NHTRC is a 24-hour toll-free hotline funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and operated by the Polaris Project, a non-governmental anti-trafficking organization, through a cooperative grant agreement with Health and Human Services. The NHTRC improves national efforts to protect victims of human trafficking in the United States by serving as a clearinghouse, providing callers with a range of services. The NHTRC receives community-based tips about potential trafficking situations, offers urgent and non-urgent service referrals, and provides comprehensive anti-trafficking resources and technical assistance to the anti-trafficking field and to the general public. To perform these functions, the NHTRC maintains a national database of organizations and individuals working in the anti-trafficking field, as well as a library of available anti-trafficking resources and materials. We encourage you to take a look at their website to see what materials they have that may be of use to you. Bringing it into focus for our state, you see that there have been more than 2,500 calls to the NHTRC hotline from 2007 through 2018, and there were 625 reports of trafficking. 70% of the reported cases were for sex trafficking, 12% for labor, and 18% were a mix of both sex and labor or unspecified. Data from the NHTRC are the best available data we have on reported cases of trafficking. Note, however, that these numbers do not reflect the number of incidents of trafficking or the number of trafficking victims. These are reports by victims or concerned members of the public. Beyond the reported incidents, we know there is much more activity that is simply unreported and unrecognized. Nationally, these industries are the top 5 venues for reports of labor trafficking. As you can see, domestic services account for the greatest number of reported incidents. This is followed by agriculture and traveling sales crews. I'm sure that many of you may be familiar with traveling sales crews. These are entities that travel home to home or business to business, selling goods such as books, candy, or magazine subscriptions. They tend to stay for a few days to canvass an area, and they often have a van of workers who spread out on foot, knocking doors. Restaurants are also a highly susceptible industry, as you can see, and an industry that many of you are familiar with through the course of your work. Here on this slide, you see some additional industries where labor trafficking has presented. We encourage you to take a look at the typology of modern slavery at the website provided here on the slide. The Polaris Project's research team analyzed 32,000 human trafficking cases over the past 9 years, which is the largest data set on human trafficking in the United States ever compiled and publicly analyzed. The team identified 25 types of human trafficking in the U.S. and drafted a report which describes each industry business model, trafficker profiles, recruitment strategies, victim profiles, and methods of control that facilitate trafficking. As you look at the business types, we hope that things will come into focus for you as you realize how you, as an official within your city or town, could intersect with these businesses through the course of your daily work. Labor trafficking is often embedded within legitimate commercial enterprises, and only by an awareness of vulnerabilities and the indicators might you be able to recognize a suspect situation that bears investigation or referral. Trafficking occurs in rural, urban, and suburban settings in different business industries. So while some communities may have more vulnerabilities than others, we know that no city or town, large or small, is immune. So who are the workers who commonly become enslaved into a trafficking situation? There are some common characteristics of vulnerabilities that will likely come as no surprise. Some of these victims are suffering with addiction, or they owe a real or perceived debt to an employer or someone who arranged for the job. They may have uncertain immigration or documentation status. They may lack employment opportunities due to a variety of socioeconomic circumstances. There may be language or literacy barriers to being able to access legitimate employment, and they may be victims of past abuse. Labor trafficking occurs among adults and children, foreign-born, and U.S. citizens. It is widely known that immigrant workers are at a higher risk for labor trafficking victimization due to fear of deportation and the ability of a perpetrator to use documentation status as leverage. But this is not a solely an undocumented worker problem. Even workers on the J-1 visa program, these are cultural exchange programs including work and study-based programs, the H-2A visa workers in agriculture, and H-2B visa workers for temporary or seasonal labor services. They're all at risk for labor trafficking. According to a 2014 study by the Urban Institute and Northeastern University that looked solely at labor trafficking cases, most foreign-born trafficked workers, 71%, had entered the U.S. legally, and most of them, 69%, were undocumented at the time they left their trafficking situation. As I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, labor trafficking cases are hard to find, more difficult than sex trafficking cases. We as a state need to do a better job at finding cases, seeking justice for victims, and prosecuting the perpetrators who are profiting from this crime, which means we have to recognize and overcome some of the known challenges to identifying these cases. The lack of awareness among law enforcement, prosecutors, service providers, frontline responders is something we're trying to combat through training such as this and through dissemination of information to targeted audiences. Massachusetts did not pass its own anti-trafficking law until 2011, so it's still a law that prosecutors and law enforcement are adjusting to in terms of case development. Another challenge is the conflation of trafficking with smuggling. These crimes are distinct. The shorthand way to think of both is that smuggling is a crime against the border, while trafficking is a crime against the person. The biggest challenge by far is that indicators can be hard to spot. There is nothing inherently alarming about someone working. Traffickers are often able to maintain a facade of legitimacy, going about their business, transacting with consumers who go about theirs. Recognizing victims is challenging because they may be reluctant or unable to come forward. Employers usually create a culture of fear and often disorient or completely isolate workers. And there's sometimes a misconception, if you even hone in this close to a trafficking situation, that this might be a matter of workplace dispute, contract disagreement, or simply wage disputes. In order to support local and state inspectors, compliance officers, and law enforcement, we've launched a first-of-its-kind labor trafficking app in an effort to equip all of you with some 21st century tools. In fact, learning about this app may be the reason that many of you are joining us today on this webinar. In a partnership with Boston University, we created a multifunctional mobile app to provide training and resources at the fingertips of investigators and first-line responders. Through dissemination and use of the app, Our collective goal is to increase identification and connect victims of labor trafficking with services. The app is an educational tool with a focus on the indicators of labor trafficking under Massachusetts law. It also serves to connect investigators with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center and other local victim service providers in order to identify resources for victims. All of this within easy reach, on your phone, and at your fingertips. Our Result app, which stands for Recognize and Evaluate Signs to Uncover Labor Trafficking, is a web-based tool that can be accessed on both a mobile device and a desktop or laptop. You can access the app at www.traffickingresult.com. Our app allows a user to assess observations where red flags for labor trafficking may have presented, or where something you have observed just seems off. After agreeing to a legal disclaimer, the user can assess any one of up to or all 6 elements of forced services under Massachusetts law, which the app calls categories, simply by going through a series of yes or no questions and then getting one of 3 results, which provide guidance for what the user may want to do next. The results a user can get based upon the answers provided to questions are: 1, there are likely indicators of trafficking. Consider reporting to law enforcement. Or 2, there are potential signs of trafficking. Consider evaluating more categories for a better result. Or 3, it is unclear whether this is a labor trafficking situation. Consider evaluating more categories. It is important to know that there is no automatic referral of information to law enforcement or victim services through use of the app. If a user wishes to make a referral to law enforcement or contact a service provider to assist a victim, the app simply provides you with accurate referral information. It does not trigger a report. It is also important to know that no information that a user enters into the app is saved or stored by either Boston University or the Attorney General or any third party. If you are law enforcement and in a position to interview a potential victim or survivor, you can view tips prior to your interview to help you prepare and plan for this critical opportunity. If you're dealing with a survivor who is in need of services, click on the resources option for referral information related to shelter, food, safety, immigration, and legal services. And finally, if you'd like quick access to state and federal statutes, you can access this information by clicking on the Massachusetts Law link. We invite you to take out your mobile phones, open your browser, and log onto www.traffickingresult.com. You can add a website shortcut to your phone so it will appear just like an app icon on your home screen. You can follow the directions on this slide depending on whether you have an iPhone or Android. If these instructions do not work for you, you can find any number of other instructions on how to do this for your device just by Googling instructions for the type of mobile device that you have. If you're accessing the Result app on a desktop or a laptop or tablet, you are advised to browse to the site using Google Chrome, and we suggest bookmarking the site for fast, easy access where you need it. To view a quick tutorial on navigating the app, you can view a short digital tutorial which takes a user through the screens and describes what each of the options present. While we won't go through the tutorial here as part of this presentation, you can note the address for future use. You can also get to this video by going to www.mass.gov/AGO/LT. Let's dive a little deeper into some common indicators of trafficking. I won't read each of these off since you can look at them as I'm speaking, but just to highlight a few points in the context of observed working conditions for potential victims. Often labor trafficking cases first surface as wage complaints or issues regarding someone's pay or lack thereof. A victim may be unable to identify his or her employer. They may experience threats or intimidation by the employer. When we at the Fair Labor Division see or hear these red flags, we know to dig a little deeper to see if there may be something that is deeper than what is initially being reported, but which is articulated in different ways by victims. It is unlikely that someone would report this behavior by starting out the conversation with, "I am a victim of labor trafficking." But through piecing together statements that are made by a victim or one's own observations, a picture can come into focus that this may be more than what is first being presented. Here are some potential indicators relating to someone's living conditions that may warrant further questioning or investigation. We do know that in some cultures, employer-provided lodging is the norm, and that not everyone who is living in substandard living conditions is working in forced services. So none of these indicators are dispositive, and context is, of course, important. One of the indicators of trafficking is the lack of control a worker has over him or herself. It's important to note that while physical restraint can be an obvious indicator of forced services, restraint by robbing an individual of other means facilitating freedom of movement or escape are probably more common, such as confiscating one's passport or controlled or no access to a person's own money or wages. And of course, the way that someone presents him or herself in appearance, health, body language, and social cues could signal a problem. So again, none of these warning signs proves that a crime is being perpetrated, but by being aware of these indicators, if these flags present themselves, it may be worthy for you to dig a bit more into what might be going on below the surface. We hope that this graphic on the left-hand side of this slide looks familiar to all of you. This one-page reference sheet is a compilation of information taken from multiple sources of research on labor trafficking, which Attorney General Healy mailed to each of your city and town CEOs in July of 2018, asking that it be distributed to key personnel such as business and building and health inspectors, code enforcement officers, assessors, licensing staff, human services staff, school department personnel, police, fire, and emergency management departments. All of you who have access in varied ways to the families, businesses, and visitors in your city or town. If you have not received a hard copy of this, you can view it, download it, and print it from the website address listed on this slide, or you can email us at labortrafficking@mass.gov, and we can mail you copies. We'll now get into the specifics of the law a bit here. You'll see here listed is, on this slide, our Massachusetts labor trafficking statute. Our labor trafficking law contains some language which mirrors our state sex trafficking law. Terms such as knowingly, subjecting, recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, etc. But the focus here is on a person being subjected to forced services rather than commercial sexual activity, as our sex trafficking law guards for. We also note that our state law shares some similar language to the federal trafficking law. However, unlike federal trafficking laws, our laws do not require us to prove force, fraud, or coercion as part of the labor trafficking situation in the way that the federal law requires. We think that this is an important distinction. Of course, although we need to establish one of the 6 prongs of forced services, which I'll go over in the next slide, the language of our statute does not require these elements of force, fraud, or coercion in order to establish a violation. The criminal penalties for a person convicted of labor trafficking or forced services in our state are serious. Not less than 5 years in state prison. That means there's a minimum mandatory sentence of 5 years in prison for a conviction under this statute, and a person could face up to 20 years or life if the victim is under 18. Additionally, the statute lets us know that it envisions being applied to business entities as well, since there are specifically prescribed penalties in the statute for businesses. That is a $1 million fine. As we just discussed, our labor trafficking statute uses the term forced services, and that term is further defined in the statute as you see here. Forced services may be shown by establishing any one of the 6 prongs that are listed. If there is clear evidence of one of these prongs, then we are in a position to consider whether this situation is one that rises to the level of being charged under the labor trafficking statute. In labor trafficking referrals that we have seen at the Attorney General's office, the prongs we have encountered most often involve threats, abuse of the legal process, often related to immigration status, controlling a person's passport or legal document, or causing financial harm to that person. Financial harm is defined as a detrimental position in relation to wealth, property, or monetary benefits by another's illegal acts. It's a fairly open definition. There is not yet any state case law which further defines financial harm beyond the statute. We think it's clear that financial harm is not simply a failure to pay a person. Rather, underpayment and withholding schemes could certainly fit under the definition as well. The services definition here is also helpful in clarifying that this does not always have to be a per se job, but labor trafficking can be established in situations where, in the simplest sense, one person is directing the efforts of another person. It's through the analysis of the financial harm prong where we often have interplay with our state's wage and hour laws. In fact, we've seen that it is this piece that individuals feel most able to bring forward. The fact that they have not received pay or have been paid less than what they earned. This scenario has in fact been the segue for several of our joint Human Trafficking Division and Fair Labor Division investigations. As stated at the outset of this presentation, we believe that municipal professionals may hold many of the keys to assisting law enforcement partners in the identification of trafficking victims because of the nature of your work and your unique vantage points. Through the course of your daily work, if you could keep the red flags or indicators that we just went over of trafficking in your mind, then you may find that you have opportunities for interacting with potential victims because your work has you interacting in various capacities with known high-risk industries. Have you ever seen traveling sales crew businesses in your city or town? Well, your municipality may require door-to-door solicitation permits, which would require the filing of an application or for a permit. Maybe you can require disclosure of their intended route or target areas in your community, and maybe you could inspect and observe their activities and talk with their employees. And likely, you could probably take enforcement action if they're operating without a permit. These sales crews utilize local lodging and restaurants. Your sanitary code inspectors may interface at either of these types of businesses on an inspection and may interface with victims. Does your city or town require general solicitation permits? If so, you may interface with begging rings. Even if your town doesn't require a solicitation permit, we know that with these types of activities, the police are often called by other businesses for so-called nuisance or trespass reasons, and this may necessitate a call to the local police department. Through the course of talking with members engaged in the solicitation, are there any red flags that are being presented by the workers? Do you ever have carnivals in your community? Because of their transient nature, carnival workers are vulnerable to labor trafficking. Your city or town likely requires electrical permits for temporary hookups or hawker, peddler, transient vendor licenses, and temporary food vendor or handler permits and sanitation inspections. By being on the fairgrounds and observing its many operations, inspectors may be able to pick up a lot about what is going on with the workforce. Domestic workers, who make up the largest percentage of reported labor trafficking cases, are particularly difficult to get access to since they're working in and are often isolated in private homes. However, City and town assessors and housing code inspectors may interact with domestic workers during a property inspection. And because domestic workers may have limited opportunities to interact with the outside world, municipal inspectors who are accessing homes may serve as a lifeline for someone who may need help. Every city or town in Massachusetts issues common victualler licenses for its restaurants. You may have commercial food permits and or food warehouse and distributor permits. Do you have health code inspectors and registered sanitarians seeing all of the back of the house personnel and operations at food service establishments? They may be poised to see red flags among restaurant or food handling staff. Every city or town has construction to varying degrees, be it residential or commercial development. Building inspectors and electrical inspectors may see suspicious activities during an inspection. In fact, last summer, we received an email from a local building inspector from a community in Bristol County who entered a business establishment and observed something that concerned him that he reported to our dedicated email address for labor trafficking tips, questions, and referrals. Does your community have agricultural or aquacultural businesses requiring permitting or inspection? Do you issue permits for farming, keeping of livestock? Depending on how large any harvesting operations may be, seasonal workers are often housed on the employer's premises. So there may be additional inspection opportunities for municipalities that regulate aspects of these businesses, which are quite vulnerable to labor trafficking. Do you have any recreational facilities, such as amusement parks, summer camps, golf courses, or resorts? These businesses often utilize young adults working under a J-1 visa program, which has some well-documented vulnerabilities for trafficking. You may have permitting, licensing, or inspection requirements or authority that may allow you to access and observe these operations. What about your community's first responders? Police, fire, and emergency management professionals access both homes and businesses. Firefighters conduct fire prevention and fire code inspections in both public and private properties. Our community first responder professionals have an opportunity to observe many situations that undoubtedly could serve as critical intersections with victims. Additionally, these employees are likely to be recipients of tips, referrals, or calls for help either from victims or a concerned neighbor. So it's important that these officials in particular know about the crime of trafficking and the need to dig deeper based on what is being brought to them. And finally, a note about commercial cleaning. We have seen labor trafficking in the commercial cleaning industry. Some municipalities and state agencies contract out their cleaning services for their buildings and properties. If you're in one of these communities, you may make an effort to get to know the cleaners who move in and out of your workspaces going about their work and develop some trust. We also encourage you to use your city or town's buying power to help in eradicating forced labor. Consider adding a contractor acknowledgement to your standard municipal contract that states your commitment to buying only lawfully produced and sourced goods and services. On this slide, you see a standard contract term required by anyone contracting with the Office of the Attorney General. This language is also available on our office's labor trafficking website at www.mass.gov/AGO/LT. We encourage you to approach your city solicitor, town council, mayor, manager, or select board chair to discuss incorporating this affirmative stand against trafficking as further means to raise awareness about this issue. Moving on from the specifics of the law and how you may come face-to-face with a victim, we'll now discuss some of the intricacies of interacting with a potential survivor. These next few slides will go over some of the things that we have learned in working with victims of trafficking in order to offer you some tips. In reviewing the list here, the big takeaway is attempt to build trust. If we want to be in a position to hear from a potential survivor of labor trafficking, we need to understand that their willingness to disclose information will likely be premised upon an assessment of whether to trust us. As you've already heard, there are usually so many barriers in place that make it difficult and complex for a survivor to believe that they can entrust their story to someone else. But if we recognize this, if we begin from a place of understanding, then we may be in the right place for a survivor's story to unfold. Additional considerations to keep in mind. If you're getting to a point where a victim or a survivor is disclosing their situation to you, think about the logistics of the situation in which you are questioning them and what information to gather initially. Try for open-ended questions. Let the person tell their story. If you are law enforcement, you may be moving to a more detailed disclosure. If you're not law enforcement, think about a referral to law enforcement at this point. As we have discussed, immigration and cultural isolation are some of those factors which make initial disclosure difficult and complex from the get-go. If some of these red flags have gone up, it may be that your best bet is to help an individual think about safety planning before they are in a place to disclose what their trafficking situation has been. We have learned to approach investigations in a trauma-informed manner. Interacting with those who experience trauma in their lives in such a way can make for better investigations, ultimately a much better dynamic with the survivors, a better end result for all involved if we're approaching our investigation in this manner. Deportation is a fear that many victims and survivors grapple with. Connecting survivors to immigration legal advocates is helpful on this front. Immigration legal advocates can assist survivors determine how they can interact with immigration authorities in a way that is not threatening and may be positive. See the list of resources at the end of this webinar for details on this type of a referral. An important program to know about when dealing with this vulnerable population is the federal program allowing for U and T visas. U, non-immigrant status, also known as a U visa, is for victims of certain crimes. The T, non-immigrant status, also known as a T visa, is for victims of human trafficking. U and T visas are designed to help protect victims of crime. This program recognizes that lack of legal immigration status in the United States may be among the reasons some victims choose not to come forward to work with law enforcement. By stabilizing their status in the United States, immigration relief can be critical to providing victims of crime a greater sense of security that also makes it easier for them to assist law enforcement and prosecutorial efforts. The T visa is a special option for individuals who've been victims of trafficking. In order to qualify, an individual must be able to demonstrate he or she has been cooperative with U.S. authorities, that is, local, state, or even federal authorities. Similar to the T visa, the U visa is a special immigration status for victims of violent crime. There is a list of qualifying crimes. It is ideal for the survivor to have a legal advocate to assist in pursuing this process. This status can be pursued by a survivor at any point after they have come forward and reported their crime. Law enforcement and prosecutors are often called upon to do certifications for these applications. This just means that your agency certifies the application to essentially confirm the person was a victim of a crime and that they have been cooperative with any investigation or resulting prosecution. It is important to note that certifying does not mean that you have granted anyone status or think someone should be granted status. The certification simply indicates to the immigration court that the person has been compliant. It is ultimately up to the immigration court or judge to make the adjudication of status. So after seeing an overview of labor trafficking and how to deal with victims, it's probably clear to you that labor trafficking does not fit neatly into any one investigatory box. In order to evolve in our identification and prosecution of these crimes, government at all levels needs to be sharing information and working with non-governmental organization partners. These cooperative efforts will undoubtedly lead to more prosecutions and extrication of victims from forced servitude. We all have a role in working to expose these crimes. Here and on the next several slides, we've listed potential referral options as well as some victim service organizations for your consideration. if you encounter a situation that gets to that point. On this slide, you'll see contact information for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, where you can talk with an advocate, get referrals for victim services in the area, file a report of trafficking, or email questions. We've also listed contact information for Attorney General Healy's Fair Labor Division, where reports of wage complaints can be filed and questions answered. As mentioned during the presentation, these cases often first surface as wage complaints. So if you're interacting with someone who is not being paid and you're unsure about trafficking, it's advisable to file a wage complaint. We've also given you the direct link to our labor trafficking webpage. We continue to add content to that as we need to, and we have a labor trafficking email address if you'd like to email questions, tips, referrals, or provide any feedback or observations on this topic. And finally, we've listed the BU School of Law's Immigrant Rights and Human Trafficking Program, which is a resource if a victim is in need of legal representation, especially as it relates to immigration status and the U and T visa programs, which we talked about earlier. Just as a reminder, if the situation you encounter is an emergency, please call 911. We also want to flag that in situations of suspected labor trafficking, where the potential victim is a minor under 18 years old, you would need to call the Department of Children and Families, or DCF, and file a 51A report. DCF will then be able to engage with that victim and provide appropriate resources for the minor. We've also listed here contact information for Attorney General Healy's Human Trafficking Division. This is a non-emergency number, but if you have non-emergency information to be referred to the Human Trafficking Division, you can call during business hours. Again, here are some additional victim service organizations. We found that it's valuable in the referrals that we have worked on is connecting with local cultural organizations. These organizations can be a wealth of help and culturally competent information. We encourage you to facilitate outreach to such local groups as may exist in your community and with whom you work already on many issues. And finally, on this slide, you see the Attorney General's Office main contacts for labor trafficking tips and referrals. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. If you have questions or comments about this issue or the content of this webinar, please send an email to labortrafficking@mass.gov. We hope that you will stay engaged in this issue, and we thank you for your partnership in this regard.